Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our webinar participants from around the globe. Welcome to this DevX Career Webinar, your 60-minute guide to a standout CV. I'm Kate Warren, Senior Director and Editor of Careers and Recruiting at DevX, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check to make sure everyone can hear me. If you can you please type yes into the chat box? All right, great. Looks like everyone can hear, so we will go ahead and jump right in. So as many of you know, your CV is really the single most critical item to your job search. Whether you're applying to jobs, requesting informational interviews, or looking for your next consulting gig, having the right CV is really a must-have for anyone considering a career change. So during this webinar, we'll be covering expert advice on the ins and outs of creating a standout global development CV, a simple formula to effectively showcase your expertise, and tips for optimizing your resume in a digital recruiting world. To discuss this in more detail, we'll be joined today by a DevX CV writing expert and senior consultant at Be the Change Careers, Tom Lemon. And Tom is one of our resident CV experts here at DevX and a career consultant. He helps guide clients through the process of expressing their experience in terms that will attract the attention of recruiters and hiring managers. As a certified advanced resume CV writer with extensive development, public sector, private sector, and entrepreneurial experience, he is adept at translating your skills and accomplishments across sectors to really highlight and showcase your expertise. So we're delighted to be able to draw on his expertise today during the webinar. After the presentation, we will allow plenty of time for Q&A, so you'll be able to enter questions using the chat box and the Ready Talk window. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We'll be keeping track of them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can as time allows. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, please note that although I will not be able to deal with them myself, do please send a message through the chat box, and one of my colleagues will be able to assist you. During the webinar, we will be live tweeting from the @DevXCareers Twitter handle. Our Twitter hashtag for this and other DevX webinars is #DevWebinar. So if you want to interact with others listening, just use this hashtag, and feel free to send us questions through Twitter as well. I would now like to hand over to our speaker, Tom Lemon, who will kick off the presentation. Again, any questions you have, feel free to send them our way, and we will get to them after his presentation. Tom, I'll kick it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Kate. Well, welcome, everybody. And it looks like we have a great turnout today. And I just want to start off by reemphasizing something Kate just said, that your CV is the most critical tool of your job search. It's your first impression in many cases, and you can't minimize the importance of the value of a well-written, well-coordinated CV. With that in mind, the agenda for this webinar is in front of you. We're going to look at the global development sector specifically, the global development CV versus the standard resume. We're going to look at ways to make your CV stand out. We're going to look at keywords and customization. We're going to look at how to express your professional accomplishments. We're also going to look at some dilemmas you might face in the development sector that you might not face in other sectors, and how to think about ways to address those dilemmas. We're also going to look at some common sense tips to make your CV stand out. And then we'll just go into questions. So with that in mind, we'll go through the presentation. So the global development sector is obviously very competitive. You'll know that you might notice that when you apply for jobs, sometimes you don't even get responses back. And that has a lot to do with the fact that hundreds and sometimes even thousands of people are applying for the same job that you're applying for. So to stand out from that pack of applicants, you need a real standout CV. Global development has different norms and expectations than other industries, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So your standard CV advice or resume advice might not apply exactly in the global development sector. Another issue is that if you're working in the international development sector, and you have been, a lot of aid workers are on the move. Whether you're a consultant and you're looking for your next job, you're in a position and you're just looking for your next project, you should have your CV ready because it's a quick-moving industry. So in the private sector, oftentimes, especially in the United States, you're going to have a resume that is often 2 pages, and if you're an advanced career person, you might have 3 pages. The curriculum vitae, that's a more internationally recognized document, and especially in global development. Both have similar characteristics, but generally the CV is a little bit longer, and it includes details that you might not include in the resume. And a little bit further on in the presentation, we'll talk about some of those details that you're more likely to include in a development sector CV. Both the resume and the CV provide information about your achievements, your skills, your professional experience, and your education. Those are characteristics that are common in both the development CV and the resume. A CV also is going to provide information, or is more likely to provide information about trainings that you have, certifications that you have, publications and presentations, memberships, technical skills, languages, and regional experience. This is development sector specific. You want to add information about that, especially if you're applying to a certain region or if there are language requirements. But what's important in these additional sections is to provide information that's pertinent to the work that the position that you're looking for. So if you have training in CPR and you're looking for a job, or you have training in cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a first aid thing, and you're looking for a job as a researcher, you might not include the CPR. But if you have training in CPR and you are looking for a job as a field worker, you might include that because that's going to be in an area where you might need to use that. But you want to be careful about what you include and what you don't include. Finally, a CV can be longer than a resume. A resume, again, is 2 to 3 pages, often, and sometimes 1 page. The CV can be 3 to 5 pages or more, especially when you start adding the extra information. It might be hard to read this, but I wanted to show this slide because it's important to see the flow of this document. There's your biographical information. We'll talk a little bit more about this line right here. These are taglines. We start with your key qualifications, and then we go into professional experience, followed by education. Again, these are the most important parts of your resume or your CV, and they are the same sections that you'll find in your resume. The additional sections follow that, and they're additional information. But in order of importance, and we'll go through that in the next slide, this is the most important part of your CV. This is what's going to be seen first, and when hundreds and thousands of people apply for a position, this is the part of your CV that will most likely get you put into the next review pile as opposed to the rejection pile. So I also wanted to show this version of the CV because I wanted to show you the flow of formatting in the white space. The white space is actually really important because it lets the reader move from this information to this information to this information easily. So looking at the next slide, this is the front page. This is what's important. And what I want to talk about here is, first of all, you want to provide a way for the potential employer to contact you. I'm sorry. So this is what's called a tagline. the tagline tells the employer, the potential employer, what you are professionally. And again, this is very important, and this is something that you can customize to match the wording that you find in the position description for the job that you're applying for. The next section, so for example, in this case, environmental and agricultural sciences, program and project management professional, the position is looking for a program and project management, a program and project manager or a project manager. If the position were looking for a senior director or a country director or a country team lead, you might change this to say environmental and agricultural sciences, program and project management, senior leadership. Again, what you're doing is you're using the wording from the job description or the position description to let the reader know that you have the qualifications that they're looking for. Okay. The next section is the key qualifications section. And the key qualifications also come from the position description, and they use keywords that are used in the development sector, things like program and project management, capacity building, strategic planning, relationship building. These key qualifications should come from the position description. They're different than keywords that you would find in the private sector. And in global development, these are keywords that are repeated and understood to be specific to global development. Some of those, there's some samples here, are program and project management, as we mentioned, monitoring and evaluation, capacity building, team leadership, training, budgeting, donor reporting, and compliance monitoring. So it's important when you put your CV together, and I recommend that people start with a base CV that is a good general CV that you can send out to any employer. But if you're really interested in the position, you should really go into that position description. And I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead to, I apologize. You should really go into that position description and find the position-specific keywords and phrases and customize your CV for that position. Another thing that you can do and that you can find within the position description are acronyms. And it's good to use acronyms that are, because it shows your experience and familiarity with the work and the organization. And there are common acronyms like M&E referring to monitoring and evaluation, WFP is World Food Program, DFID, UNHCR, USAID. But you have to be careful with acronyms. And one of the most common mistakes in a CV is to talk about things in terms of acronyms that you're familiar with, but the reader might not be familiar with. So the general rule is to not assume that any reader will know what you're talking about in terms of an acronym. And I put together this sentence to show as an example. And you see this a lot in CVs, and I see it when I'm redoing CVs for people. This example led FLR program during planning and implementation stages, managed FLR and SAP for the UNFF under the XO for ComSat. I mean, every one of us has worked in a position where we will use that terminology with our coworkers, and everybody, it's almost a contest. Who doesn't know what this means? But when you're presenting yourself to a potential employer, it's better to assume that they don't know what you're talking about. So let's take that same sentence and identify what we're talking about. Led federal regulatory leadership program during planning and implementation stages. Now I can use the acronym because I have identified it. And so I've I can say I managed FLR operations below driving, and then I'm going to say something that I'm driving program growth by 75% each year over a 7-year period. When you're talking about your professional experience, it is helpful to use a methodology that's common in the CV and resume writing industry called CAR, which is context, action, and results. What most people do, or what a lot of people do with their resume, is they instead will post their responsibilities, and their CV tends to look like a job description as opposed to a list of accomplishments. So this is an example of what somebody might put in their CV: responsible for the day-to-day operations of a region or sub-office, answerable for the work done by staff and the overall success of a sub-office program. It tells what you were supposed to be doing, but it doesn't give the reader any information about how well you did your work. So another way to represent that is to start off with a verb, an action verb, that you led a team. So what was your accomplishment? You led a team. How many? 5 direct reports, including 2 project managers, 1 M&E specialist, 1 communications officer, and 1 security officer in a previously underperforming regional sub-office. After 6 months, the office was recognized as having achieved the fastest growth rate of all 12 sub-offices. That uses the CAR methodology, the context being previously underperforming regional sub-office, the action being you led a team, and the results were that you achieved the fastest growth rate of 12 sub-offices. Simply using that methodology in your position description sets you apart from other applicants who simply post the responsibilities of their position. It tells the reader that this might or might not have been your responsibility, but it's what you did. And it tells the reader that you know what you did and you know the value of your actions. Okay. There are some common dilemmas, especially in the development sector, that you can address, or we can talk about ways to address in your CV. Some of the common dilemmas include work history that includes many short-term projects and consultancies. I know, especially in the development sector, you might move from 1-year contract to 1-year contract to 1-year contract, and in the private sector, that would look like you can't keep a job, but we know in the development sector that you're doing contract-based employment. You might have large gaps in your employment. The development sector is not an easy sector to work in. It's a sector that might have you living abroad in a place where conditions are hard for a year or 2 at a time, and then you come back and you need time to decompress, or you need time to find your next position. So you might have to address these gaps in your employment. Another dilemma is that people who are trying to get into the global development sector from another sector might not feel like they have the experience as it's presented in the position description to move from the sector they're in to the global development sector. So we'll talk a little bit about how to address these common dilemmas. The first one is work history includes many short-term projects and consultancies. Well, in order to address that, it depends on how you've been doing this. If you are a consultant you're a private or an independent consultant, you can list these as specific projects that you've done within a consulting period. So let's say over a 5-year period, you've had 3 different major consulting jobs or major contracts. You can list your position as independent contractor or independent consultant for that 5-year period. And then a typical way to say that is select the project, and then under each bullet point, you list a description of the project that you have, the projects that you are involved in, the major projects. So you are listing those projects, even though they're with different organizations under different contracts, under one position, and it covers that 5-year period. That's a very typical way to do that. The next dilemma is that you have large gaps in your employment. In the global development sector, it's more common to see gaps. Employers understand gaps a little bit more. So short-term gaps aren't as critical necessarily as long-term gaps. If you have 5 years of experience and there's a 2-month gap between each of your contracts, I wouldn't worry too much about that. But if it's 5 years of experience and there's a 1.5 years in between two, you might want to address that period of time. And one way you can do that is that you can include projects and volunteer work that you've done in between that aren't necessarily related to your career, but it can help fill those gaps. Transitioning from global development to global development from another sector. This one is actually, for me, it's easier to talk about this than the larger gaps. What most people don't realize is that the global development sector is a lot like the private sector, but it uses a lot of different terminology. And when I work with people on CVs who are coming from business, for me, sometimes it's really easy to find those transferable skills. We talked about the skills that are being looked for in the development sector, like monitoring and evaluation. In the private sector, that's quality control. And so when I look at somebody's CV from the private sector, I start to take all of those skills and I tie them to a development sector skill. And I translate those words into the global development keywords. I also try to pick out industry jargon that is used in the sector that they're coming from and translate that, or just soften it and explain what that means, so that in the development sector CV, the reader can know how that experience and how that skill will translate into the development sector. And then also, if you're moving into the development sector, you've probably been interested in it for many years, and you want to include volunteer work or consulting work or pro bono work that you've done in the private sector or as a private sector citizen, to include that in your CV. So finally, what I want to talk about before we go into the question and answers is just some common sense CV tips. Again, your CV, it cannot be emphasized enough. Your CV is the first impression that a potential employer is going to get of you and of your experience. It's probably the most critical tool of your job search. It distinguishes whether you will be invited in for an interview, and again, it sets the first impression. So if your CV stands out, you stand out, and then the next step is to impress them personally, either through an interview or through follow-up. So when you're looking at your CV, to apply consistent language, formatting, and punctuation. Use proper make sure everything's spelled correctly. Use proper or consistent verb tenses. In your current position, speak in the present tense. Leads teams, develops material, manages staff. If it's a position that you're no longer in, keep it in the past tense. Manage staff, things like that. If you don't do that, if you don't use those consistent rules, that will stand out and you won't make a good first impression. When you're sending your CV, use a simple file name. Last name, your first name, CV. Something that will identify the document to the reader, to the potential employer, just through the file name. Third one, review, review, and review. Don't let little mistakes make you look bad. Have a friend proofread your CV. Have two friends proofread your CV. Have a professional proofread your CV. And just one thing that I think is really important, use a professional sounding email address. Gmail is a great free email server. Your name, maybe your name and something that identifies you because your name might not be available, versus something that talks about your hobbies or your outside interests. Also, think twice before using a current employer's email address. That doesn't necessarily make a great first impression that you're looking from your position right now. It's not. I mean, people understand that, but it's probably better to use your own personal email address. So we've covered a good deal of information, and we're getting ready to go into the question and answer segment. So I'm going to ask Kate Warren to jump in and moderate that part of the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And yeah, just to reiterate your point, we have done surveys of recruiters the past couple of years that we work with at DevX, and a question we ask is what's the number one mistake they see job seekers make, and consistently by a large margin, a response is not having a well-written CV that showcases their experience and particularly tailored to the positions they are applying to. So just again underscoring how important working on your CV document is to your job search. So let me get started with a few of the questions. One of them is, do employers prefer a resume to a CV since it's shorter? What do you think is your experience on having the shorter resume format versus a longer CV format in the global development space?
That's a great question. I would say it depends on where and with whom you are applying. In the international development sector, the multi-page development sector CV is preferred. If you are applying for a position with a U.S.-based organization that either a nonprofit or a private sector for-profit business, you might consider the resume over the development sector CV, or a resume with modification. And because that's more traditional within the U.S. format. If it's European, if it's multinational, strictly development, I would say the development sector CV is the way to go, or a hybrid of that. Another key point is I have multiple resumes and CVs, and I use the same base, but I have different ones for different sectors and different organizations that I would consider applying for.
Great, yeah, and I'll also point out to those of you on DevX, if you do have multiple versions of your CV, maybe one focused, say, more on your technical expertise, one more on your project management, you can upload multiple versions of your CV to your DevX profile. Just encourage you to give them a name so that recruiters can understand what the differences are between them, but that is completely acceptable, and actually most recruiters prefer that you do that so that you are really focusing your skills and experience directly related to the kinds of people they're looking to hire. And so another interesting question here, do you recommend using data visualization on the CV? I've seen lots of documents recently with charts and graphs to indicate language fluency, skill level, etc. How do you feel about incorporating some of these visuals into a CV for the global development sector, Tom?
Well, I would tell you that I think that you have a really valuable piece of real estate called your CV. And the most valuable piece of that real estate is the first 1/3 of the front page, which is going to determine in a lot of cases whether the rest of the CV gets read. If you think that data visualization will add a great deal of value or will express something in a way that is different than you might be able to express it in writing, you might consider it. I've seen data visualization a lot in private sector resumes. Mostly where I've seen it are in areas of sales and in senior management positions, where a senior manager might be, like a vice president might be showing how they increase the profitability of the business over a 3-year period. Unless you really know what you're doing with the data visualization, in the development sector specifically, I would caution against it. But that's based on my own experience with it.
Yeah, and I do find a lot of employers are fairly conservative in what they expect in a CV, although, could be job specific if you're applying to a job where you would actually be doing data visualization as part of that. That might be a good way to showcase that. But tend to be
that's a really good point. Yeah, another thing I would add to that is that, especially in the development sector, because a lot of the work a lot of the positions that are being posted are funded positions that are funded by development agencies or international development organizations. You really need to look at what they're asking for within the position description, and you need to tell them you need to answer the questions they're asking in the position description, because a lot of times they're taking that information and they're presenting it back to the funder or the donor, and the donor is specifically looking for the 3 points that they have asked for. So unless it adds to what you're finding in the position description, I would say keep it simple and answer the question.
Great, thanks. So another question, how far back in my work history should I include under professional experience? For example, far back as 20 plus years. Do you have any guidance on that?
That's a really good question, and I would say the short answer to that is in the development sector, most employers care most about what you've done in the last 10 years. And I think if you can go back 20 years, with relevant information, you should, especially if it shows professional progression, if it shows development sector or transferable skills that will work well in the development sector. I would hesitate to go much further back than 20 years. I would not go back 30 years necessarily. If there's experience that you've had more than 20 years ago, for example, you were in the Peace Corps, which could be really, that's a really big deal for the development sector. They like people who have been in the Peace Corps, but it was 30 years ago. You could have a professional section, a professional experience section that goes back 20 years, and then you can have a shorter section right after that saying additional experience. And you can list a couple of things that you did, maybe some volunteer work and that Peace Corps experience. But you don't provide as much detail. It's just kind of and I did this kind of thing. So I hope that answers that question.
Great, thanks. So you talked about a key qualification section as a great way of highlighting your expertise right up front at the top of your CV. And so the question is, how important is that section, and is that something that can be elaborated upon in the cover letter? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, those really good question. I will repeat that the most important real estate on your CV is the top one third, 1/2 of the front page of the CV. The tagline, which tells the employer, based on what you've read in their job description, who you are. The key qualification section it's basically allowing that first reader to see that you paid attention to the position description, you know the industry, you know what's important in this position, and you have those skills. I have program and project management skills in an international context, managing these aspects of program management for teams of this size, these kind of things. So that section should answer questions that are being asked in the position description. So I think it's really, really important. In terms of whether you can cover that include that in a cover letter, yes, you can do that. A lot of places don't ask for cover letters, and they don't require cover letters. I know in the private sector, there's been research that even when asked for cover letters, the only about 10% of respondents said they actually even read cover letters. If they ask for it, you have to provide it, but it's not the most important document. The most important document is the CV, and the most important part of the most important section is the top of the front page.
Great. Yeah, I would echo that too, Tom. And again, the surveys we've done with recruiters and we've asked them about the importance of cover letters, one thing to note is the vast majority of people always read the CV first, and then if they like what they see, will read the cover letter. So not the other way around, and that there's actually a very small portion of people that really rely on or even really care about the cover letter in making decisions. So if it is asked for, agree, it's important. You need to do it, particularly if it's a job you really want. But the CV is where most of the attention is at from the recruiter's side. So another interesting question here. Should volunteer and pro bono work go in the same section as work experience or be in a separate section?
There's two answers to that question. If you have a history of volunteering, working, and you want to cover time, it's important, and it can be important to include and appropriate to include volunteer experience in your professional experience. And I don't think you need to tell people that you were a volunteer. You can say, I worked with Habitat for Humanity for 3 years as the public relations manager for the affiliate in the city that I lived in. You don't have to say that was a volunteer position necessarily. You can if you'd like to, and you can talk about that in an interview. If somebody says, so you work for Habitat for Humanity, you can say, well, no, I was a very active volunteer, and I was very involved in it on a weekly basis, and I managed the whole section of I had responsibility for a whole section of the organization. You can also do it in that subsection that I talked about, the additional experience. If you have a full career and you're not trying to fill in any gaps, I think it's really, that section can be really important, because if they get that far, they like you professionally, and then they see, well, in addition to all of this experience, they care about their community, they do volunteer work, and it's been in this area of interest, especially if you're coming from outside of the development sector and the volunteer work is development sector focused.
Great, thank you. So another question on senior level CVs. How would you differ an executive level, senior level CV from other CVs? Are there differences in what you should highlight and how you should approach it? There are a lot of subtle differences. With a mid-level management CV or a lower-level management CV or a technical level CV, you talk in the professional descriptions. You would talk more about line-level action that you've taken. You would talk about how you managed teams, how you did, how you did field work, things that are more technical in day-to-day operations. In an executive level CV, you tend to talk more about overall results. So instead of saying you managed a team of 5 who are made up of administrators and project leadership and that kind of thing, you would say you managed an office, or you managed multiple offices over geographic regions. And you would talk more about your high-level experiences like organizational relationship building and business development. Again, if it's a
position that is for a higher level of leadership, the position description is going to be asking for things like your business development experience and your advocacy experience and your relationship management experience. So you should focus on what you find in the position description. When asked to create a CV for someone, it's common to say, send me some job descriptions for the jobs that you're looking for the types of jobs that you're looking for. And if you look through 3 or 4 different position descriptions for the positions that you're looking for, you'll find common themes. You'll find common characteristics that you can build into your base CV.
Great. That's great advice. Another interesting question here. Would you suggest using descriptive paragraphs or bullet points under your work experience? What do you typically advise?
I've seen both. Where I would use a descriptive paragraph, so generally I would use bullet points because it's quick and to the point. It uses that CAR methodology, the context, action, and result methodology, and it really clearly identifies accomplishments. Where I would use a descriptive paragraph is if I found somebody who had a position that was kind of out of the mainstream, not real clear to the reader what the position was, I might use a descriptive paragraph to explain how that position relates to the type of work I'm applying for. So sometimes things aren't straightforward. Like if you I can't think of a good example right now, but it's a position that maybe nobody's ever heard of, or let's say you're applying for a job as a project manager, and the position was a sales associate, and there's no visually I can't see how a sales associate is involved in project management. I might explain in a short paragraph, how I use project management skills on a daily basis as a sales associate in this way. So I would use it to explain something that might need a little bit more explanation.
Great, thank you. So a question about gaps and specifically maternity leave. Should we include maternity leave in a CV, or I guess also any other kind of family or medical leave? How specific should you be about mentioning those kinds of things and to explain gaps in your resume or not?
I would start by saying if you are applying for a job or a position in the United States with anybody, private sector, development sector, I would not mention anything about family. I think that the way federal employment regulations are set up in the United States, anything that you say that has to do with your family, any personal information, a lot of times with recruiters, will create red flags because they're not allowed to make selections and decisions based on anything having to do with pregnancy, family, that kind of issue. So instead of taking a risk on that particular CV, they might just move it aside. Because, and I don't know if that happens for sure, but I think there's a fear of too much information. And if you ask people in the resume and CV industry, they'll tell you, do not put personal information on your resume or your CV in the United States. On the other hand, in Europe, I think it's common to put your marital status. It's common to oftentimes put photos. And so outside of the U.S., it's a little bit different. But because you're coming from, a lot of the development sector work you get is more international. I would say stay away from that. I would say save it for the interview. If somebody says, well, why did you have that 2-year period of time where you weren't doing anything? You could say something to the effect of, I was managing some family issues, but that's all been resolved. and just
Great,
keep it
thanks.
very
Yeah,
simple.
I would agree with that as well in my experience. So are there, you talked about differences in CVs depending on where you're applying, regional, cultural norm differences. Are there differences in CVs for a project sponsored by different donor agencies? For example, would there be a difference between a CV you would use for a DFID-funded project versus one for a USAID-funded project?
Absolutely. If you apply I say there's differences in CVs with whom you're applying for. For example, if you're applying for a job with a position with USAID as a direct hire, you pretty much have to go through USA Jobs, and you have to use a USA Jobs resume that's created through their template. Same with the United Nations. I think you have to go through their process and create the forms that they require. If you're applying for a job that's funded by USAID or from DFID or from a major donor, the key is to look very carefully at what they're asking for. And they'll tell you, especially for U.S. government-funded programs, they're required by law to tell you exactly what you have to provide for them, and they can't evaluate you on anything other than what they've told you that they're asking for. And so if they say something like, it's required that you have 24 months of experience working overseas, it's really important that you show in your CV that you have 24 months of experience overseas. And so if you worked for a company from 2002 to 2004, and that's all you put, the contracting officer who looks at that is going to say, okay, December 2002 to January 2004, and they're going to only count 14 months. But if you put January 2002 to December 2004, they will count 24 months. So you have to really make sure that you're answering those questions. They might say, well, provide your salary for those periods. And if you don't provide your salary in the CV, it's disqualified. So yes, there are specific requirements for specific organizations, and you need to read the position description, find out what they're looking for, and make sure that your CV covers that.
Great, yeah. I'll add to that. I was at a talk recently about getting jobs with the UN, and they said that many native English speakers get kicked out of their application system because they don't indicate that they speak English fluently, which they don't include because they assume it's a given and obvious, but for some of these large agencies that are a little bit more bureaucratic in their approach to hiring, can't overlook all of those little details just to make sure. So what are some other kind of regional, country-specific facts of CVs to consider? An example person who wrote in said that they had a UK employer say that after hiring them, they almost did not offer an interview because they didn't have a personal interest section on my CV, which is common in the UK. Do you see any other specific differences depending on where you're applying, and have any examples of things you should look out for depending on where the employer is based?
That's a really specific question, and I would say if you're applying for a position in the UK, try to get a hold of I would go to Google and say, I would Google UK development sector CV samples, and I would look and see what kind of information they're including. And again, providing personal information in a U.S. CV is not a common practice. However, clearly in the UK they want that. I've seen that in some of the CVs that I've received from clients who are in Africa. There's a lot of different information. There's information about everything from your family status to your political affiliation to where you went to primary school, and when I go through those, I tend to clean them out and say, look, if you really don't think you need to include this, don't. Sometimes the client will say, look, in my where I'm applying, they really want to know this, so I'll leave it in, and I say that's great. But I'll also say, if you're applying outside of this area, I would recommend removing that. But look at in the market where you are and see if you can find, if you have friends who work in that market, ask them, because that's a very specific question.
Yeah, great, thank you. So one more around specific regional preferences about including photos. If you are applying to a job in a region where it is standard practice and norm to include a photo, now could that be a work-related photo, for example, of oneself working with youth in another country, or any guidance for what kind of photo you should choose if you do include one?
Well, I have a great mentor of mine once told me, I was in a low-level management position, and he said, dress for the position you want to be in. And what that meant was that, I could come to work every day in my khakis and my polo shirt, and I could be that supervisor, or I could wear a suit every day, and I could dress like the managers above me and aspire to that position. And so I would say gauge what you're looking for. If you're applying for a senior management position where they are looking for somebody who can represent the organization at high levels, I would say have a professionally done photograph in a suit in a business environment. If you're applying for a project management for a WASH program that takes you out into the field 75% of the time, I think it would be great to have a photo of you standing next to a well, working with some people to figure out how to get water from the well to their home. It's the content.
Great, that's great advice. So when you get to the point where you have many years of experience, is it better to list your CV in chronological or reverse chronological order, or organize it around your skill sets of functional format? What is your advice there?
Functional CVs and functional resumes are great tools that are used a lot of the time. There's two sectors where I think there's two groups of people who use them consistently that I think it's very appropriate. One is contract and independent contractor, like artists and professionals who do work just for themselves, and also senior level managers, senior level vice presidents. It's very common to list all of your accomplishments and then a short list of the companies you've worked for. Same with the independent contractors. They list, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, and this, and then under professional experience it says independent contractor for the last 20 years, something like that. Why it's not so common in the development sector is because of something we talked about just a few minutes ago, which is that tracking of time, which a lot of donors require. A lot of donors want to know, they say, we're going to listen to everybody who's qualified for this, and we're going to set this certain criteria, and a lot of times the criteria is the time and experience, time and position. So that chronological order tells them you were this for 24 months. So I think in the development sector it's much more common and much more appropriate, even as a senior executive, to use that chronological format.
Great, yeah, I would agree with that advice. So what advice would you give to someone who recently graduated from college and does not have a lot of experience to put on their CV? Should they include things like related coursework? Any thoughts there?
You said related sports experience, is that correct?
Coursework, so classes.
Or related coursework. Okay, yeah. Yes, I think if it's pertinent to the position you're applying for, I think that's appropriate. My first thought, if you want to get into international development, I would say find any job you can get in the international development sector and take it, even if it's an administrative job, even if it's an assistant to an assistant job, because development sector turns over very quickly, and you'll probably, if you do well, you'll move quickly. I would say as much as possible, coming right out of college, if you're still in college, volunteer. Do volunteer work and emphasize that. If your coursework has to do with the job you're applying for, if you're majoring in international development or international programs, emphasize the things that are important in that area, but don't take up a whole lot of space for things like, listing your math classes or your non-topic related classes.
Right, thank you. Do you recommend using active web links to highlight work or publications in your resume or CV?
For myself, I never use active web links, and I think active web links would be a really good tool if you're sure that the CV is going to stay on the internet. If you're sure it's going to stay an electronic document, because if you have it and it's not an electronic document, it's just taking up space. Also, because the development sector has so many specific questions, they really want you to answer the question in the CV. They don't want to go to another place to look for it because they have another 100 CVs or they have another 300 CVs to look at. So in my opinion, it's more of a distraction than a benefit. And it's nice to have, but I don't think the reader's necessarily going to go there, especially if it's not in an electronic format. So I personally would recommend not using them.
Great, thank you. I know we're getting close to time. So one final question. For anyone who's considering getting outside help, a consultant like yourself, to help them write their CV, could you briefly just describe what that process is like and what they should expect in working with a CV consultant?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first step is to send your CV or your current resume or multiple versions if you have multiple versions. If they're extremely different, if one's a retail sales CV and the other one's more related to international development, I wouldn't send both of them necessarily because the CV writer is really going to look at your skills that pertain to the position you're looking for. I would also send. We also ask you to send positions that you're thinking, sample positions you're thinking about applying for. The process can be long and drawn out, I wouldn't say long and drawn out. It can take a while because there's feedback. The first thing we do is we look at your current CV and we go through and we formulate questions because for us, there's a lot of things we don't know about you. And so the questions we ask may seem simple to you and they may seem like, why do you keep asking this in the same position? But it's important because what we're trying to do is we're trying to build an idea of your experience. Once we get those questions back, we develop a draft, which says, this is what we think you're telling us you did, and this is how we would express that. And that draft is really important too, because the reader needs to go, or the client needs to go back and say, no, this is not exactly what I did. I did it more of this, and they need to correct for content at that point. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 drafts. Sometimes I've worked with clients it's been 15 drafts because the client is very specific about what they want to see. And in either case, that's fine. Sometimes it's the second draft and it's perfect. People like it. But there is that back and forth. There's that information gathering. I'd say the hardest part for the client is answering all the questions because you have to think back to when you were in that position. But I think my experience is that most clients at the end are really happy with the results, especially if it's a collaborative process where it goes back and forth several times. And a good CV writer will be really responsive and really kind of instructive to the client and saying, even though you think that looks really good, here's what a recruiter will think about it. Here's what a recruiter might say about that. So again, it's an iterative process. It requires feedback from both sides. But in the end, it produces a document that I think most people are very proud of when they present it.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So I am afraid we've come to the end of our scheduled time for this webinar, but thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you learned a few things that you can take back and apply to your CV. We have been tweeting out a few other resources, including CV templates, etc., on DevX that might be of use. So check out at DevX Careers Twitter handle if you want to read those. You can also find a lot of this advice on our Career Center page on devx.com. So if we weren't able to get to your question today, you might be able to find answers to it there, or also feel free to tweet us and we will try to help direct you to the right advice. One of the benefits of DevX membership is access to not only live but also recorded versions of our webinars. If you want to watch this webinar again, we will be emailing it to you next week and posting it on the devx.com website as members-only content. So look out for that in the near future. Again, thank you to Tom for taking the time to speak with us today. And on behalf of DevX, I'd like to thank you all for joining us and hope you'll join us for our next online event. Thank you, everyone.